What if I told you that the U.S. could start World War III? Sounds unbelievable, right? Why would one of the greatest nations on earth start a war? Right now, there is a global concern about the inability of the American political system to handle troublesome economic realities. In fact, the renowned rating agency Standard & Poor's once noted that our view that the effectiveness, stability, and predictability of American policy making and political institutions have weakened at a time of ongoing fiscal and economic challenges. Now, the political, even geopolitical repercussions of those challenges can only be expected to grow, noting liberal despair over the government's inability to combat economic depression. John Judas of the New Republic argues that a global depression far longer and more severe than anyone expected now seems nearly impossible to avoid. As the experience of the 1930s testified, a prolonged global downturn can have profound political and geopolitical repercussions. In the U.S. and Europe, the downturn has already inspired unsavory right-wing populist movements. It could also bring about trade wars and intense competition over natural resources. Even a shooting war is possible. If a war does break out, America may win it because of their superior military strength. Now, let's take a look at three interesting facts regarding the U.S. debt. For several years, the nation's debt has been bigger than its gross domestic product, which was $26.13 trillion in the fourth quarter of 2022. Debt-to-GDP is a useful metric for analyzing the debt over long time spans, as it puts the debt into relative terms by comparing it against the size of the national economy. Looked at this way, debt as a share of GDP has gone through three main growth phases in recent decades. These have corresponded with periods when the federal government ran large budget deficits. The Reagan-Bush years of the 1980s and early 1990s, the 2008 financial crisis and subsequent Great Recession, and the pandemic-caused recession of 2020, when federal debt spiked to an all-time high of 134.8% of GDP. The ratio has come down a bit since, but remains well above pre-pandemic levels. Today, the Federal Reserve System is the single largest holder of U.S. government debt. While the Fed regularly buys and sells Treasury securities to execute monetary policy, it brought treasuries in massive quantities during the COVID-19 pandemic in an effort to keep the U.S. economy from buckling under the strain of shutdowns and quarantines. At its peak in April 2022, the Fed held more than $6.25 trillion in U.S. government debt, more than double its holdings just before the pandemic hit the U.S. in March 2020. The debt could push America to start a war, and they may win it because of their abundant resources. Serving the debt is one of the federal government's biggest expenses. Net interest payments on the debt are estimated to total $395.5 billion this fiscal year, or 6.8% of all federal outlays, according to the Office of Management and Budget. That's more than $100 billion more than the government expects to spend on veterans' benefits and services, and more than it will spend on elementary and secondary education, disaster relief, agriculture, science and space programs, foreign aid, and natural resources and environmental protection combined. Debt service as a share of federal outlays peaked at more than 15% in the mid-1990s, but generally, falling interest rates have helped hold down payments even as the dollar amount continues to grow. In fiscal 2021, the average interest rate on federal debt was a record low 1.605%. But with the Fed raising its policy rate to try to cool off the economy, the U.S. has started paying more to borrow. The average interest rate on federal debt last year ticked up to 2.07%. If you like this type of content, please subscribe to our channel. This video took a long time to make, and I would really appreciate it if you could hit the like button. Now, the United States has run annual deficits, spending more than the Treasury collects almost every year since the nation's founding. The period since World War II, during which the United States emerged as a global superpower, is a good starting point from which to examine modern debt levels. Defense spending during the war led to unprecedented borrowing, with the debt skyrocketing to more than 100% of gross domestic product, GDP, in 1946. Over the next 30 years, sustained economic growth gradually reduced the debt. Beginning in the 1980s, ballooning defense spending and sweeping tax cuts ushered in a new period of rising debt. During the 1990s, a combination of tax increases, defense cuts, and an economic boom reduced the debt as a percentage of GDP, and, starting in 1998, brought 4 consecutive years of budget surpluses, the first such streak in 40 years. Deficits returned under President George W. Bush, who oversaw a period of tax cuts, war spending in Afghanistan and Iraq, and major new entitlements such as Medicare Part D. Annual deficits hit record levels, more than $1 trillion under President Barack Obama, who, in response to the Great Recession, continued the Bush administration's bank bailout program and provided hundreds of billions of dollars in fiscal stimulus. With all the fiscal debt, starting a world war may help America get rid of it. And right now, the geopolitical situation seems primed and ready for a war. Just last March, as President Biden was facing pressure to intensify U.S. involvement in Ukraine, he responded by invoking the specter of World War III 4 times in one day. Direct conflict between NATO and Russia is World War III, he said, something we must strive to prevent. He underscored the points hours later. The idea that we're going to send in offensive equipment and have planes and tanks and trains going in with American pilots and American crews? Just understand, and don't kid yourself, no matter what you all say, that's called World War III, okay? More than any other presidential statement since September 11, 2001, Mr. Biden's warning signaled the start of a new era in American foreign policy. The United States now faces the real and regular prospect of fighting adversaries strong enough to do Americans immense harm. The post-September 11th forever wars have been costly, but a true great power war, the kind that used to afflict Europe, would be something else, pitting the United States against Russia or even China, whose economic strength rivals America's and whose military could soon as well. Since February 2022, the war in Ukraine has created an acute risk of U.S.-Russia conflict. It has also vaulted a Chinese invasion of Taiwan to the forefront of American fears and increased Washington's willingness to respond with military force. That's called World War III indeed. Yet, how many Americans can truly envision what a third world war would mean? Just as great power conflict looms again, those who witnessed the last one are disappearing. Around 1% of U.S. veterans of World War II remain alive to tell their stories. It is estimated that by the end of this decade, fewer than 10,000 will be left. The vast majority of Americans today are unused to enduring hardship for foreign policy choices, let alone the loss of life and wealth that direct conflict with China or Russia would bring. But there are some important lessons that we have learned from the 20th century world wars. Perhaps the most important is that the American combination of technological and financial leadership plus abundant natural resources is impossible to beat. The U.S. has been the dominant Anglophone empire since the Suez Crisis in 1956. With the threat of nuclear Armageddon, the U.S. successfully deterred the Soviet Union from advancing its Marxist-Leninist empire in Europe much beyond the rivers Elbe and Danube. If World War III does occur, the U.S. will probably be the country on top after the dust settles. When that happens, the power correlation could be similar to post-World War II, when Japan and Germany lost the war and became vassal countries. Hope you enjoyed watching our video. Thank you for watching. Do also check out our interesting take on why Google won't exist in the next 5 years right here.